We're going to get going in a minute, but I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping things first. While I'm doing that, please feel free to introduce yourselves to us and each other in the chat box. We'd love to know who's here, say hello. Our BSL interpreters today are Stacey Green, who is interpreting at the moment, and Donna Ruan, whose video is on, and she is waving. If you require interpretation, please make sure that the interpreters are pinned. So for Stacey now, if you can do this, you can hover your mouse over the video. There should be 3 dots in the right-hand corner. Click on those dots and click pin video, and that will ensure that Stacey is always visible, especially when there's a slideshow on. Donna and Stacey will be swapping throughout the webinar, and we will let you know when that's going to happen. If you're having any problems, please ask for help in our chat box. We also have Katie Ryder from Stage Text captioning the webinar today. If you'd like to view the captions, please click on the close captioning button on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a CC. If that is not appearing at the moment, or if there's any moment in the webinar when that's not appearing, that probably just means that we're on a break or Katie isn't captioning at that time, so don't worry, it should appear. And you might experience a short delay with the captions as Katie is live captioning the webinar. Just to make everyone aware, your cameras and mics should be turned off for the duration of the webinar. So if they're turned on at the moment, if you don't mind just turning them off for now, and that just kind of makes sure that our broadband capacity doesn't get overloaded, and it makes it easier to view the webinar as well. And please do keep them off for the duration until we ask otherwise. For those of you who are new to Zoom, there are 2 ways to view our speakers, either on speaker view, where you can only see the person who's speaking, or on gallery view, where you can see anyone who has their video on. And you can change that view on the top right-hand corner of your screen. There's a chat box that is live at the moment, and Ben will be there throughout the webinar to answer any technical questions or queries. You can also use the chat box to share any thoughts or resources with other attendees. So just like I said, you should all be saying hi to each other at the moment, so do use it for that. There will be moments to ask our speakers questions throughout the webinar, and you can do that in a couple of ways. The first way is by typing that question into the chat box. If you do this, it's probably better to type that and address it to Ben, who is called questions brackets Ben, and you have an ability to direct that question directly to Ben in the chat box. The chat gets very busy, so by doing this, you're just ensuring that your questions don't get lost. And the second way is to raise your hand. And by raising your hand, we know that you have a question, and at an appropriate time, we can ask you to turn your audio or video or both on, so that you can ask Francois and Sarah a question. And the raise hand button is, if you open up the participants box, which is on the bottom of your screen, there should be a button in there that says raise hand. You can raise and you can lower your hand at any point during the webinar there. If you've already sent a question through to Ben prior to the webinar, we will get to the question when we go to our panel discussion. So if it hasn't been raised with Francois, don't worry, we will get to it. Again, just to say, if you do have a question, please only use one way of asking it. So don't put your hand up and put it in the chat box, or if you've sent a question through already, please don't repeat that question in the chat box. Just to let you know, our webinar is being recorded today for publication, so if your audio or video does get turned on, you may be included in that recording, just to let you know. And there's going to be a short break of about 5 minutes, about an hour in, just to give everyone a time to look away from their screen, go to the toilet, whatever, and we'll let you know when that's coming up. So before we get started, we'd just like to thank our Derby Can project partners. So those include our Derby-based NPOs, which are Derby Theatre, DADA, Baby People and Quad. Our strategic national partners, which are China Plate, Crying Out Loud and In Good Company. Our independent theatre and production company partners, which are Milk Presents, Not Too Tame, Maison Fou and Wild Rumpus, and our other local partners, which is University of Derby, Derby County Community Trust, and Derby City Council. Our speakers today are Francois Matarasso and Sarah Brigham from Derby Theatre. Sarah's going to open the webinar in a minute with some more information on Derby Can, and Francois will follow her with a look at developing and creating co-creation models. Francois is going to take questions throughout his webinar. There's a couple of points that he'll open it up throughout his talk, and then him and Sarah will come on together at the end for a panel discussion. And then Sarah will close the webinar with a little bit more information about the commissioning process going forward and how to apply. So just a reminder to everyone before we start to turn their videos off and their audio off, and I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you, Rosie. And a huge thank you to China Plate and IGC for sorting the logistics of today. So welcome to this session, and it's really aimed at opening up a dialogue for Derby and its artists on what words like co-production and co-creation really mean. As Rosie mentioned, this has been brought to you by Derby Can Project, which stands for Derby Creative Arts Network. See what we did there? And I'll just tell you a little bit about that project now. But to find out more, you can join us for an information event on the 22nd of June. So if you want to know more about what Derby Can is, and also our sister project, This is Derby, then on the 22nd of June, you can find out more, and full details and booking are available on the Derby Theatre website straight after this webinar. So, as Rose mentioned, Derby Can is led by Derby Theatre, and it involves 12 partners: Quad, DADA, Baby People, Derby County Community Trust, Maison Fou, Milk Presents, Not Too Tame, In Good Company, Crying Out Loud, China Plate, Wild Rumpus, University of Derby, and Derby City Council. I'll just slow down for the interpreter. Sorry, Stacey. Great. We have some very simple aims. We want to bring together 3 key groups of people. 1, the venues and organisations of Derby. 2, the artists and performance makers who are connected to Derby. And 3, the community of Derby. But instead of the usual relationship in which one provides the venue, one provides the art, and the third consumes it, we want all 3 to work together to equally create art and work which is relevant, artistically ambitious, and impactful. We want to change how art is seen in the city, who makes it, and how we all talk about it. We recognise that to do this, we all have to learn, we have to relearn, and we have to reflect on our practice. And so this is the first step in doing that. Today, we have many artists on the call, but we also have all of the partners and all of the other NPOs and venues who are also involved in this area of work in Derby. The programme itself will create outdoor work, indoor work, work in the community, and work on our stages, and all of it will be produced in Derby for Derby, although we hope that it will reach a wider audience. It's funded by Arts Council England, the University of Derby, and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So thank you to those organisations for helping us to dream big as a city and start to make work in new ways. After you've watched this webinar, there is an opportunity for you to apply to be part of a further artist training programme, which has a bursary attached for you to attend, and also the opportunity to pitch for a £10,000 commission. But I'll tell you about all of that at the end of this session. So on to today. When we began this journey, we knew that we needed an expert to guide us, mentor us, and offer us some provocations. And so we approached Francois Matarasso, an artist who certainly I've admired for a long time and whose weekly blog has been keeping me sane in these crazy lockdown times. Francois is a community artist whose work embraces creative projects, research, and writing. He divides his time between the UK and France and has experience of community cultural work in about 40 countries. His latest book, A Restless Art, How Participation Won and Why It Matters, was published in 2019. So now I'll hand over to Francois. Thanks.
And I'm so sorry, Francois, before you start, I think we're just going to swap from Stacey to Donna interpreting. So if anyone has Stacey pinned, now is your time to repin Donna.
Okay. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hopefully you can now see the screen. I'm going to talk through, I'm going to talk this through in two halves. So there'll be after about 15 or 20 minutes, there'll be a moment to pause and have a break, maybe ask some questions, and then we'll pick up again, because I don't know about you, but this is quite a strange thing to me, sitting in a room a long way from you, talking to a computer. Okay. Okay, right, hopefully that will work. So Sarah has already outlined the three elements of Derby's Creative Arts Network, combining the resources and ambitions of local venues, the artistry and skills of the independent sector, and the strength and imagination of the community. And this image is, you may be familiar with it already. It was the Port Talbot Passion done by National Theatre Wales in 2011, which really did, I think, do all three of those things in terms of bringing a whole town together over 3 days for a version of the Passion at Easter. In the original bid, there are some promises made that I thought were interesting and worth flagging up at the beginning. So the intention, the reason for doing this is to develop new work of substance, which is of course desirable but ambitious. Testing a brand new model of co-production, that I think is even more ambitious. I'm not sure that there's as much scope for innovation as we sometimes think there is, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Using cultural democracy to co-create work. Cultural democracy was a concept that informed my thinking when I first became involved in community arts in the early 1980s, and then it kind of fell out of fashion. It's come back into fashion in the last 3 or 4 years, but I think it means different things to different people now. And I will talk a little bit about cultural democracy, because unless we know what we mean by terms like that, it's not very helpful. Attracting new audiences, fair enough, everyone always wants new audiences. Fundamentally shift the dialogue about who makes work and how a city collaborates. Again, these are big ambitions. So the first thing that struck me when I looked at that set of promises, as it were, is that it's really important, I believe, to understand the roots of co-creation. This is not a new idea, and in the book that Sarah mentioned, I wanted to talk about the theory, the practice, and the history of community art, and I ended up deciding that I needed to start with the Enlightenment. This is a struggle that has been going on for a long time. So unless we remember that from the beginning of industrial society, from the beginning of a place like Derby turning from a county town of an agricultural county into an industrial city, working people have organised themselves to have access to culture in all kinds of ways. And one of the examples that I mention in the book is a fantastic example. It was called the Salford Lyceum. It was founded in 1838, I think, in Salford, when Salford was an exploding industrial city on the outskirts of Manchester. And it probably had at the time a population of about 40,000 people. And the Salford Lyceum already had 2,000 members who were paying 6 shillings a week to 6 shillings a year, I think, sorry, to be part of this library. And they did classes, they did amateur drama, they did all kinds of stuff. And that goes on throughout the 19th century. The choirs, choral societies, amateur orchestras, art associations, all of that is part of the claim of working people to be heard, to have access to culture, and to be able to represent themselves. In the 1930s, there was radical theatre and touring shows happening for much the same kind of reason. So Joan Littlewood, for instance, who's now been remembered in the Fun Palaces movement, she started in a communist theatre company in the northwest of England in the 1930s. And her company was one of 8 operating socialist theatre in the industrial northwest at the time. During the 1940s, which I think has some particular resonance for now, CEMA and ENSA were created. CEMA, the Council for Entertainment, Music and the Arts, and ENSA, the Services Entertainments Organisation. One of the reasons they were created was because then, as now, there was a sudden massive unemployment among artists because of the crisis that the country was facing. And CEMA merged into the Arts Council of Great Britain in 1946 and led to the connection of culture within the welfare state that was created in that post-war world. That in turn led to new claims from the community arts movement in the 1960s and the emergence of cultural democracy in the 1970s as a concept from the Council of Europe. I will come back to cultural democracy in the second half of this talk. But the first thing, that the reason for wanting to take you through all of that is because I think the heritage really does matter. This is a long, long struggle about who controls art, who has access to art, who, above all, who decides what is good and what isn't good, what stories are legitimate to be heard, what stories are out of bounds, and so on. And unless we are aware of and honour the people who've come before us to do this, I think we're missing an important part of what this is about. The other reason for saying this is that culture is contested. It's absolutely contested, and we're seeing that today. This is not just a picture of an 18th century gentleman. It happens to be a picture of Edward Colston, whom nobody had heard of outside Bristol until about a week ago. This picture is still in the council house of Bristol City Council. This is the image why Edward Colston is a name that has been heard of today. You have to accept that culture is contested. It is one of the metaphors I have used is that culture is the parliament of dreams. It's the space in which we negotiate our values as a society, as a community, as a city, as Derby. We negotiate between ourselves things we disagree about, what visions we have of the world, and that also, I think, has to be accepted. And the third thing that comes out of that history is that value is always and necessarily subjective. the part of the way in which it is contested is that there are interests in the art world which do not want to accept that value is subjective or that culture is contested, because in persuading the world that the academy, for instance, knows what good art is, that confers considerable power to those institutions who are seen by the rest of us as being able to tell us what is good and what isn't good. And I think that power needs itself to be challenged, and that was always the central principle of the community arts movement. In all of this, I think it is vital to know where you stand. We don't all stand in the same place, and I have never wanted to persuade anybody to stand in a place that I approve of. I know where I stand, I know what I believe in, but I think this is a territory, and we'll see that more in the second half of what we're talking about. Now, this image is from Spencer Tunick's Sea of Hull, that was part of Hull's year as City of Culture in 2016. 3,000 people were keen to participate in that artwork by taking their clothes off and covering themselves in blue paint. Personally, I can't think of many things I'd less like to do, but it doesn't matter, because I respect the choice that people make about wanting to be participating in that kind of way. So what is co-creation? Co-creation is not a word that I use very much. One of the difficulties is that it defines a territory in which all of these concepts and terms have been used, and I dare say some others that I haven't thought of. It is also a complicated term because it is widely used outside the arts. So I'm currently working in a project which involves new technology, and spending quite a lot of time working with people from a very different culture to mine, who also have ideas about what co-creation is in digital technology. So personally, I don't use the term co-creation very much. I have talked about participatory art. One of the reasons for preferring the term participatory art as against the last slide and the term co-creation is because it is at least reasonably understandable by the people that I might work with. Most of the terms on the previous slide, I think, are not understandable by the people that I have worked with. The other reason for using it is because I have a very simple definition of participatory art, which is simply this: participatory art is the creation of art by professional and non-professional artists. And that's what you can see in this image from a wonderful project in Portugal called the Movement for Expressive Photography. And it's a project from part of their work with blind people making photography. That definition is deliberately simple because it has to embrace this enormous spectrum of work, from Spencer Tunick getting people to stand naked in the street to the kind of work that I do. But it is already has two important concepts in it which are not always accepted, and I'll talk briefly about those. The first is that it is the creation of art. There are lots of things that are called participation in art and culture, which I would not describe as participatory art. The most obvious of which was probably art education. Art education is primarily about teaching people how to develop skills that they may use in a variety of ways. It is not about the creation of art. And I think the work that I personally find least satisfactory in this field is the work which is the closest to education, but it's not education. It doesn't see itself as education. It is, in effect, a kind of going through the motions. I think unless the work is producing a work of art at the end, and this image that you can see is from a piece that I saw in Barcelona about 3 years ago that brought together about 50 to 60 people from different communities across the city. But they made this really beautiful piece that was part of the GRAEAE Festival, which is the city's most prestigious arts festival. And in doing that, they took their place alongside the professional artists who are the main people programmed in that festival, and they were able to say something through art about what mattered to them. The second thing is the idea of professional and non-professional artists. I use that word in a very specific way, and I'm not going to talk in detail about that, but I'm not essentially concerned with who is being paid or who is not being paid. It's more to do with identity, your self-identity, and the identity that you have in society. The reason for talking about professional and non-professional artists, as opposed to artists and participants, or artists and ordinary people, or a variety of other euphemisms that are called, that are used, is that I think the only way to be an artist is to make art. And if you are making art, as the people in the previous slide were, it doesn't matter. You're not a participant, you are making art, and therefore you are an artist, in the same way as when you cook, you're a cook. It's to do with the act of doing something. But there is an important difference between a professional and a non-professional artist, because they bring different things to that experience. This image is from another project that I saw in Paris, from a festival, jazz festival, an organization called Banlieue Bleue. On the man in the cap is a New York musician and rap artist called Napoleon Maddox. Don't unfortunately know the name of the young boy he's about to fist bump with, but he was part of a project that they did together called Home, which I saw performed. Now the point is that in making their work together, they are bringing different resources to that. So the professional artist brings education, skills and expertise that they have acquired. They bring knowledge of their field and experience of doing these kinds of projects. They bring a context, which means that their judgments in that subjective judgment of culture are nonetheless informed by and relate to the wider context of their practice, and that enables them to make an informed judgment about what is happening. The non-professional artist, on the other hand, they bring talent as well, hopefully. The non-professional artist brings an open mind. They precisely don't have the same rules and expectations that the professional has. They are able to bring new ideas, to say, well, why don't we do it like this, and offer something that the professional artist has forgotten might be a way to do something, or a way to solve a problem, or a way to express something, because the professional artist has been taught that the way you make theatre or the way you make music is like this. They also bring knowledge. This photograph was taken in Seine-Saint-Denis. The two people who are about to fist bump don't speak the same language, but in order to make something here, the professional artist needs the knowledge of place, the knowledge of what it's like to be a 13-year-old kid growing up in Seine-Saint-Denis in the toughest outskirts of Paris, in order to make something. And that kid has something to say. They are bringing with them some important ideas and a need to say the things that they want to express. And of course, they also bring talent to this party. And by working together as artists, they are both working together. They are pooling their very different capacities and resources to that experience. And what I love in this image is that it just captures the moment when you can see that two people are about to make that leap of trusting one another, at least as far as making some art together. What happens when they do that? Well, what happens is that they create art that is equally different. This is an image from a production by a company called Fada Theatre that I saw in Rotterdam about 3 years ago. Fada Theatre is made, all the members are Syrian refugees living in the Netherlands. They met in the context of an asylum seeker centre, and they created a piece of theatre that was about the Civil War, about their reasons for leaving, and about their journey to that ended up arriving in the Netherlands. Now, the point of this, two of the members of Fada Theatre, I should say, were professional theatre makers who had had careers in the Syrian theatre before the Civil War. The other dozen members had never been on a stage or wanted to be on a stage before. The point about this is that they are creating work which is neither it is rooted in their own experience of life. It is exactly about that urgency of a need to say something. It is fundamentally different experience to sit in a theatre watching people make theatre out of their own lived experience. If this performance was done by Dutch actors, it would have a fundamentally different meaning in ethical, artistic and political terms than because it's made by the people who are reflecting their own experience. But they are not simply witnessing. One day, some of these people might eventually give evidence in trials, if we ever get to there, about war crimes in Syria. But there, they will be required to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Here, they are not simply telling their story as some of the simplistic participatory work does. It's not enough simply to walk on a stage and to tell your story. You have to make art of it. You have to make something that has power to move and to resonate with people. The other thing that I would say about all of this that is critical, that flows out of everything I've said so far, is that the difference is not a matter of quality, it's a matter of kind. In other words, participatory art or co-creation is not a less good version of theatre, it's a different kind of art form. This is an image from a production that was recently rebroadcast on YouTube, but it was originally broadcast on the BBC at Easter in 2016. It's Streetwise Opera, who've been working with homeless people and people who've lived experience of homelessness for nearly 20 years now. They did a performance of the St. Matthew Passion, Bach's St. Matthew Passion with the 16. Some of the people that you can see there are professional singers with 40 or 50 years experience of singing Bach. Other people, including the figure of Jesus that you can see with the staff and the scarf in the middle, are members of Streetwise Opera. One of the reasons that I found this particularly moving is because in having the figure of Jesus, who was performed by 8 different members of Streetwise Opera, having that person performed by somebody who was not a trained singer, as actually they may well not have been in the original church performances by Bach, orchestrated by Bach in Leipzig in the 18th century. Having a non-professional singer perform Jesus was very powerful, because it suddenly brought out the sense of a victim being sacrificed by very powerful forces. It was a different experience to one that you could have had by listening to the St. Matthew Passion performed only by professional artists. Clearly, a non-professional singer is not going to sing as beautifully or as perfectly as a professional singer. They are going to sing differently, and that will create an art that is different as well. I'm going to stop there to give you and me a break. If there are questions that you have already, we can take them now. If not, you can just take a moment to go to the toilet or get a cup of coffee, and then we'll pick up in a few minutes.
Thank you, Francois. That was really amazing. I can't see any questions that have come through as of yet, but like you said, I'm just going to leave people for a minute to see if they want to address a question to Ben or raise their hand. But it's going to be a very, very brief break, everyone, just to get your thoughts together.
I know it's a lot of stuff to take in.
So we haven't had any questions come through yet, Francois. So I'll let you know, but when you're ready, if you'd like to carry on. And just to let everyone know as well, we're just swapping BSL interpreters to back to Donna.
Okay, well, if Donna's ready, then let's carry on, and then we'll have longer for the panel session afterwards. Okay, so I said earlier on that I thought the important thing was knowing where you stand, and the idea that I've outlined of participatory art, as I've said, it's a very simple definition: the creation of artwork by professional and non-professional artists. And it is deliberately simple because it has to embrace, as I've said, this enormous territory. Let me explain to you what I mean by that territory, and I want to talk a bit about the intentions. Why do people do this? So this territory of co-creation, I think, broadly speaking, since the period when the state started funding arts activity, which was during and after the Second World War, there have been three broad intentions behind why people have been drawn into doing this work. The first and still the most important, you could say the foundation of all post-war European cultural policy, is the idea of giving people access to culture. And that, of course, had its origins earlier. So a lot of our industrial cities have museums and galleries that were created by city fathers. And of course, they were fathers in the 19th century, with the intention of giving working populations access to the finer things in life as they thought. And that principle remains the reasoning for why the arts are funded. And it has been translated over the 70 years since the foundation of the Arts Council. It has gradually been translated into more and more participatory efforts. So in the 1950s, it seemed enough simply to build theatres in cities and fund them, and that would give people access to theatre and so on. But of course, we know that the proportion of the population that attends theatres and galleries is actually quite a small part of the overall population of any city. And so efforts have been redoubled, partly through marketing initiatives, partly through outreach work, through audience development. All of these different strands of work have tried to bring in people who don't attend, and that's what's implied in that promise to bring in new audiences in the Derby Can mission statement that I outlined at the beginning. There is a second intention, which I won't talk about very much because it is it's not the heart of what Derby Can is about, and it's kind of it happens less in the UK than it does in some other countries, but it is the intention to bring about social change. It is the idea that art can be used as a means to bring about social change. So you could say that Joan Littlewood, in her agitprop theatre company, touring working men's clubs in the 1930s to try and educate working people about politics, was in effect using theatre for social change. And there are lots of honourable ways of doing that. A lot of theatre for development, of artwork in international development generally has a fundamental intention to benefit people and to bring about social change. But as I say, that is a less that's a less common intention in the UK and in most of the wealthier European countries, except when they're working in poorer countries. The third is the idea of cultural democracy, and I'll say a few words about that. Cultural democracy, as far as I have been able to trace it, originates in the mid-1970s and is partly a reaction to the explosion of cultural claims and emancipation of the 1960s. So there was a conference organized of ministers of culture of European countries, organized by the Council of Europe in Oslo in 1976. And that's the first time that I'm aware that there was any formal discussion of cultural democracy. And it's very clear then, when you read the documents from that conference, that those ministers of culture and their civil servants were recognizing that there was a problem with the cultural policy that they had been pursuing since the war. In other words, this idea of giving people access to culture was not good enough, because people were starting to say, well, that's very passive. We don't simply want access to your culture. We don't want to be told what we should appreciate. We want to have our culture recognized. We want to have access to resources to make culture as well as simply to consume it. And that, I think, is the simplest way of understanding cultural democracy. It is the right to create culture on your own terms in exactly the same way as people who have had access to those resources and education and skills and confidence have in the past. And that was where the community art movement very quickly recognized that was what it was about in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was certainly part of what I had always, that's, if you like, where I would stand in this field. Now, what I think this little circle overlain on that is what I would describe as participatory art. So it's the middle of these things. It's where these intentions overlap. It is possible to pursue all three of these intentions without doing participatory art, but participatory art is an easy and an obvious way to do it. The other thing to say about these overlapping circles is that in my thinking, they define a territory around which people move. It's a territory of borders. There's a tension between these intentions, and within an organization, people may position themselves differently. Some people may care more about social change. Some people may care more about access to culture. Within the history of a project, within the timeline of a project, the project itself may start in closer to access to culture, but actually find itself closer to cultural democracy because of the way in which its own processes allow it to evolve. And over the lifetime of an individual, you may decide that you care more about one area than another. Or indeed in relation to what one particular project does compared to another, you may feel that you're positioning yourself differently. So for instance, I'm now working on a European project around community opera, which is probably taking me closer to access to culture than I would normally feel comfortable going. But I have other reasons why that seems to me to be a worthwhile thing to do, because I think I might be able to help change other things in doing that. So those are the point about all of this is it's back to that idea of where do you stand. It's about understanding your values, your beliefs, and recognizing the compromises that you're willing to make and the compromises you're not willing to make, and what effect they have on your work. Now, let me give you an example of the spectrum that I think can happen. And I want to use two projects from the 1418 Now, which was, as many of you will know, a huge cultural program to mark and commemorate the centenary of the First World War. And if I subtitled my book, How Participation Won and Why It Matters, nothing can justify that title better than 1418 Now. Because I have to say, when I started my work in community art 40 years ago, the idea that government and all of the cultural institutions of this country would see making participatory art projects as a natural and worthwhile way of commemorating an important military and historic and social moment, that would have been literally unimaginable in 1980. But the scale of it, as you can see from these figures, was huge. And of course, because it had that scale, it also had an enormous spectrum of activities. And I just want to highlight two projects to show maybe the difference between access to culture and cultural democracy. The first is this project, which many of you will know. We're here because we're here. Generally described as Jeremy Deller's We're Here Because We're Here. It was conceived by Jeremy Deller and produced by the National Theatre and 29 other arts organisations, theatres across the country. 1,600 participants took part in it. And the 1480 Now estimate that on the 1st of July 2016, which was the 100th anniversary of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, when this enormous event took place across the UK, which involved, as it says, 16,000 people appearing on Britain's streets dressed as First World War soldiers and walking about silently. At the end of that day, when it was finally revealed to be an artwork at 7 o'clock, the 1418 now estimate that 63% of the UK population had heard of it, and they had mostly heard of it or seen it, not live, but through social media. With probably to date the most successful social media art project that ever happened. Now this quote, which was from a documentary on BBC Scotland about the National Theatre of Scotland's participation in We're Here Because We're Here, is interesting, I think. It's a participant speaking about why they are choosing to be involved. And I won't read that out to you, you can read it yourselves, but I'll just ask you to hold on to that thought of what they're saying is this sense of responsibility. The main feeling is going to be one of responsibility, that the people who took part in that. Now, here's a very different project from 1418 now. This Is Not For You was produced by GRAEAE, the country's first disabled-led theatre company, founded in 1981. Now, this was a production that was very long to do, very difficult to do in a whole range of ways. But at the heart of it was the intention by GRAEAE to work with 25 disabled veterans, disabled former service people, men and women, to create a story about those who were injured during conflict. And the title originally came from something that one of the veterans who took part in the production said. He recalled being at a memorial service at the cenotaph and as a wheelchair user, and being told by somebody, a child, a young person, who shouted out from the crowd, "What are you doing here? This is not for you, this is for the dead." And that sense of being forgotten, of being excluded, of being not recognized for their sacrifice was what motivated the participants in this project. I interviewed several of the people who were involved, and this slide and the next slide are quotes from some of what they told me. As you can see, they talk about a great deal of personal input and personal sacrifice emotionally, because they needed to get across their story. As this quote says, "We made the story our own, and we had creative license to start putting our own input into each act. I came away happy because I was able to tell the story of Blesma." Blesma is the disabled, originally I think limbless, ex-servicemen's organisation founded in the aftermath of the First World War, which continues today and which has supported many of the participants in this production. So if you compare this to the quote from the participant in We're Here Because We're Here, who talked about a responsibility to commemorate and to tell other people's story, this was about people telling their own story. And for me, that is the spectrum between an opportunity to participate in a piece of work that the participants in We're Here Because We're Here, from the evidence that I've seen, and they found it profoundly moving, and it was a very powerful piece of work, but it was very different nonetheless to the kind of empowering cultural democracy that This Is Not For You represents. Now, I just want to finish with a couple of things. I'm going to say a word about what I I think community art is, and I describe my work as community art, not as participatory art. Community art, I would understand as something within the field of participatory art, but if you like, a more demanding, challenging part of that, because it is rooted in the idea of cultural democracy. And I will, I'll talk briefly about what I think this definition is trying to explain, and illustrate it with a project that I recently did, and then I'll finish with some questions about different visions of where this work could go. Sorry, let me go back to this definition. So the heart of it is the same as my definition of participatory art, the creation of art by professional and non-professional artists. But several additions are important. The first is that the reason for doing it is that it's a human right. It's Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. So that's the reason for doing it. Secondly, I want to draw your attention to the idea that the professional and non-professional artists are cooperating as equals. Clearly, that's not the case in We're Here Because We're Here, because the participants were literally drilled in how to behave in order to make that work of art coincide with the vision of the professional artist who imagined it. So the participants were not involved in setting the purposes of that work, nor the standards by which it would be judged. And the processes, products and outcomes of We're Here Because We're Here could absolutely be known in advance. They were known in advance, they were intended, and they were controlled very clearly. Journalists were briefed beforehand with what it was about, in order that at 7 o'clock on the 1st of July, there could be a very powerful media announcement and pre-prepared interviews and so on that could lead on the news headlines that evening. But in community art, the processes, products and outcomes can't be known in advance, precisely because the professionals and non-professionals are cooperating as equals for purposes and to standards that they set together. So let me show you what that means in a project that I did recently, last year. This was a creative writing project. These are some of the participants. We took a group photograph on the last day. It was a project inspired by a book called I Remember by an American artist called Joe Brainard, who died about 25 years ago, which was simply a collection of memories, but with a very poetic tone to it, because it's a series of short sentences, paragraphs, that all begin with the words I remember. And I simply took that idea to this group at the first workshop, because I couldn't go to, I needed to go with something in my pocket, as it were, when I met the people. But I had no idea that if that idea would appeal to them, if it would work. And it was entirely up to them to say, no, not interested in that, we want to do something else. And I would have had to respond to that. In the event, it did work very well, and we spent 10 weeks, 2-hour workshops, talking about memories, talking about their own lives, which are, as you can see from the previous photograph, it was a very diverse group, so their memories were equally diverse. And it ended up being a little book of about 100 pages that ended up as a collective text and a performance. One of the things that really surprised me and impressed me was as the project evolved, I was thinking it would be better not to have the person's name after each of the memories that was in the book, and I was proposing to kind of put an index at the back so you could look up whose memory was whose. And it was the group who said, no, we don't want that. We want it to be a secret. so that only the people in the group, the people who are the co-writers of that project, know whose memories is whose. As a reader, you can guess, and sometimes because of the distinctiveness of the memories, your guess may well be right, but you can't know. And that was a choice, an artistic choice that they made. They wanted to make it a collective text that was anonymous and only had their names on the cover and at the back of the book. So that's what I mean by community art being a process that you can't foresee and can't plan and can't know what it will be until the very end. Now, just to conclude, as we come to the end of this, I want to ask a question, and it's this: if participatory art is now normal, if, as I've suggested in the subtitle of my book, participation has won, what relationships to the centres of cultural power do we want? By the centres of cultural power, I mean the people in the institutions who largely are still able to say what is good and what isn't good, who are able to say what is worth funding, what isn't worth funding, what is aesthetically powerful and what isn't, who say this is good art and this isn't. Well, what relationship do we want to have? The relationship of community art has been historically contestatory. It has challenged those centres of power. And I think there are two models, and I'll just finish with outlining these. The first I would describe as a conciliatory model. This is another image from 1418 Now, Danny Boyle's piece, Pages from the Sea, where a series of sand images were created at the end of 2018 to be washed away by the tide. Now, a lot of the work in 1418 Now, I think fitted this, what I describe as a conciliatory model, in the sense that it was artist-centered. It was conceived by an artist. It was typically associated with an artist's name. So an artist became the author. There was a significant institutional investment. Most of this work was led by cultural institutions who also branded it and authored it, if you like. It involved mass participation. In other words, thousands of people took part in these events. There was limited creativity, and this image is particularly striking because you can see just how limited the creativity is. You get a stencil and you get to rake out what is marked in the stencil. And this is the bit that I think is most controversial, it allowed very limited room for dissension. In other words, if you wanted to participate in this work, then you had to abide by the rules. In effect, you had to take your clothes off and paint yourself blue in order to be part of it. At the other end of the spectrum is an emancipatory model, and this is an image that I love because it's from Enteleki Arts, who are a wonderful small intergenerational community arts organisation based in Deptford in southeast London that I've worked with on and off over the years, who've done a succession of memorable and impressive projects. And I just love this image because it has such confidence from all of the people you see there, who are all non-professional artists, able to project themselves, an image of themselves and their creativity in the world in the way that they choose. And this emancipatory model, by contrast with the previous one, is art-centered, not artist-centered. It's about making works of art which are collective and shared. It's about human investment. These projects only work because people like this want to make them work. You can't make them by deciding as a cultural institution that this is something we want to do. They are about equal participation between the professional and the non-professional artists. Everyone has a say, and what ends up getting decided is a matter of negotiation, not imposition. It's engaged creativity. People have to invest themselves into it and to draw on their own imaginations, their own experience, their own stories to bring to this. And that means that it is responsible speech. One of the projects that I've written about from of Intellectual Arts in the book is an extraordinary piece of work called Bed, which has evolved over several years, which involves one of the members of Intellectual Arts being in a bed in their night clothes in a public street and on their own, and people come up and talk to her, and they will hear stories. How that happens is really quite risky. And the first time they tried it, and they tried it literally by wheeling the bed that they had been rehearsing on out of the Albany in Deptford, which is where Intellectual Arts meet, into the market, which happens outside the Albany, and seeing what happened. Well, part of what happened is that a couple of girls came in and spoke to the box office at the Albany and said they wanted to report a crime because an elderly person had been abandoned in the street, and they were right, because the project is about the crime of how society abandons its elderly people. So the Albany were getting calls from the police and from social services asking what happened. And that's what I mean by responsible speech. Intellectual Arts had to learn fast, and they had to take responsibility for what they were doing, and they had to, as the project developed, they had to develop people around that who could help the people who encountered that performance to process it and to deal with it. That became a much more mature and successful piece. And all of that, ultimately, it is capable of empowering people in the sense of giving them access to new skills, new confidence, new challenges, but within their control. In other words, they are using these processes to empower themselves. Empowerment is not something that can be given, it's only something that can be taken. And on that, I will leave this talk, and thank you very much for listening. If you have been, I have no idea, frankly, whether there is anybody on the other side of this computer right now, but I hope you have been. And if you have been, then we can have some discussion and conversation.
Thank you, Francois. We're definitely listening. That was fascinating. I think probably now, we have had a couple of questions through, but I think probably now is an opportune moment for us to just take about a 5-minute break to let everyone absorb. For all of our participants, if you do have any questions, please do just raise your hands in the participant box or send them through our chat box to Ben. And when we come back, Francois and Sarah will be talking a little bit more about what Francois has just gone through, and from Sarah's point of view, from how Derby Can is approaching this. So I think it's about 10 past now, so we'll come back at around 12:15. so much. Welcome back, everyone. Another thank you to Francois for that incredibly interesting talk and inspiring talk as well. Just to let people know, we have Stacey, BSL interpreting this section. I'm going to start off with some questions that have been sent in prior to the webinar that are both for Francois and Sarah. And the first is, what do you think the opportunities and restrictions are for digital co-creation?
I have no idea. I've been thinking a lot about.
Sorry, Francois, just to stop you there. We just haven't got captions at the minute.
Okay.
I want to get them back up and running before we start. Great, there they are. Thank you.
Okay, so I said I've no idea. Partly it's my age, partly it's because the technology is really new, and I think that some people are getting to grips with working out what it's for and what it can do. Other people, I think a lot of how it's currently being used is translating what we do in other forms onto this form, and that's not so satisfactory. I think it's changing very fast. We're learning quickly about digital technology because of lockdown, and I think better answers will come up soon. But I think that the core of it is the core of the work is about connecting people, and digital technology can connect people in really rewarding ways. I've been surprised how much Skype, which I didn't like very much for years but did use, how video conferencing has become a much more palatable experience, and one that I now think I know better how to use and make meaningful. So yeah, sorry, it's not a very good answer, but it's a process.
From the Derby Can perspective, Rosie, the training course that I will talk about at the end, we have Quad and China Plate working together to deliver some specific training around digital and digital co-production. But also I direct artists to In Good Company, because they've been running some digital masterclasses around this area as well. And the things that Derby Can are starting to deal with now is we know that there are challenges around broadband poverty. We know that not all of our audiences who we want to reach necessarily have access to the digital. And so that's something that we are, as a project, exploring as well. You're muted, Rosie.
Every time. Ben, I wonder if you can put a link to In Good Company's website in the chat, just for anyone who would need it as well. Great, so the next question is, projects that are co-creative often involve a big commitment from volunteers and participants. Can you share some of your experiences of these types of projects, both creatively and practically, particularly in relation to thinking about and managing the expectations of those involved?
Okay, there's two slightly different things in there. One is the commitment. I mean, I think from the very beginning of my work as a young community artist, turning up on, working on council estates in London and the Midlands, my assumption was that I wasn't entitled to anybody's attention or time. I had to earn it. And consequently, what I mean by that is that if people will give their time and effort and enthusiasm if they if they are enjoying themselves and they see a purpose to it and it's meeting something that they want to do. And if they're not, then I'm doing the project wrong, you know. So that to me is the first part of the promise that I make, which is that it has to be enjoyable. Otherwise, why would you do it? You've got gas bills to pay, children to bring up, you know. Anyway, so and that's the other part of the question, which is the about expectations. I've thought a lot over the years about the promises that you make. And I think what matters most is that you understand the promises that you make, whether you're making them explicitly or implicitly, and that you keep the promises you make. In the early days, and probably people still talk about parachuting in, and you know, short-term projects. I have no problem with short-term projects. You know, you can create a project over a weekend that says we're going to do an amazing project this weekend, and that's what it is. The promise is we're going to do an amazing project this weekend. The promise isn't that we're going to be here next weekend. With good intentions, I think people often get trapped into making promises that they can't keep. So, you know, got money to do this, and we're trying to find money to carry on. Much better to say, we're doing this, and don't tell anybody you're looking for money to carry on. Do this as a self-contained creation of a work of art, a project that is worth doing in its own right. And then if that's a success and you've been able to find a way to carry on, then do another project, but don't make open-ended commitments and promises.
And it's just worth adding that I think Francois covered all that in terms of artists, but in part of Derby Can is that we'll also be harnessing a voluntary force to train and develop and look at things like front of house activity and event management and things like that. So again, if you come on the 22nd of June, we can talk a little bit more about how that works within the project.
The next question is, what strategies can artists employ to create work that is formally challenging and political, whilst also engaging working class communities?
I don't see a tension between those things. I think I've made work that I think all the work I've been involved in, all the work I admire, that I've seen, that if it fits into that idea of being cooperation between equals for purposes and to standards that they set together, then if you want to make formally challenging and politically radical work, you just have to find people who want to make that too. And there, in my experience, the people that I've worked with I've never met anybody who's really frightened by anything that was being made. If they understand and have been part of the process of making it, it speaks to them because they've contributed to it and they understand it. I've seen people be willing to do far more surprising and radical things, like the example that I just gave, that people were in the I Remember Leicester project. I thought people would want to have their names more prominently attached. They would feel more sense of ownership, but they wanted to make it more of a collective piece. So I think that it's about finding common purpose in a group of people to do something that they really care about, and then you can go anywhere.
I don't have anything to add.
And then the last of our pre-sent questions is, ethically, how can arts organisations run overwhelmingly by white people justify imposing their Eurocentric values through outreach work in minority communities in the name of diversity and to tick funding boxes? Would you agree that it is a tokenistic virtue signalling in a purity spiral of postmodern society?
Well, the answer to the first question is obviously they can't. Although, I mean, it's the access to culture intention, and it's a tricky thing, access to culture. I sometimes, when I'm being a little provocative, I describe it as the missionary position, you know, that it's people who believe absolutely in the value of the culture that they care about and see, and like missionaries, they think it's their job to convert people to their values and their culture. And when I put it, I mean, I say it's provocative because if I put it like that, it is, you know, it's horrible and domineering and an imposition, particularly when you use all the resources of a publicly funded cultural institution to enable you to do that. At the same time, the other end, you know, the democracy functions on the basis that we advocate for what we believe in, you know, and I will happily, I mean, I've just spent 40 minutes explaining why I think community art is good, you know, so am I imposing domineering virtue signaling? I hope not, but I hope that I'm trying to explain respectfully the cultural values that I hold and that I care about. And so what I'm saying is, I don't think there is anything inherently wrong in saying this is what I believe and trying to, and taking that into the agora, into the public space and saying, you know, planting your flag and standing by it in that idea of this is where you stand. The problem is one of power, and when power is used to impose and those values on others, and that's the whole basis of community art, was challenging the power of institutions to do that. So of course I don't subscribe to that, and I don't want it. I don't think it's right, but that we should defend and argue for the values that we hold, I think is natural and part of how democratic societies function.
And I just add that I think the key word there in that question, just reading it from the box, is the word imposing. That's the kind of the premise that Derby Can is built against. So the whole plan of it is to bring together, as I said at the beginning, the community and the artists and the venues in equal relationship, and that the art isn't pre-imagined and pre-thought up, that it is found with and in partnership with those communities. But to bring it specifically to Derby's context, let's not pretend that that's not going to be difficult. And that's why we're beginning by reflecting on what we're doing now through processes like this, and encouraging everyone to consider what their practice is and how and who isn't in the room, and how and who we make these conversations with. The consortium that we put together very deliberately involved independents, organisations who are MPOs, organisations who are not MPOs, and organisations who have nothing to do with the arts, so the Football Trust and the university and the council. And again, that was an attempt to begin by listening rather than begin with a predetermined. It would have been in lots of ways much more easier for Derby Theatre to go, we will make a partnership with this theatre and this theatre, and we will then take our art and take it there. But the whole kind of premise of Derby Can is to try and have a plurality of voices, and that through that the art can emerge together and in partnership with the community. But what we know is, exactly because of the things that Francois said, the problem is power and the problem is agency, and those voices are not as loud as my voice, for instance, as the CEO and artistic director of an NPO. And so the challenge for all of us, I think, is to really understand how we ensure the balance of those voices remains equal throughout the process. And that's set within a context in which Derby Theatre got the money to do it. Do you know what I mean? So there is already an imbalance in power because of how the funding came around. So it's a really careful, and we'll get it wrong. I have no doubt we will get it wrong, and maybe I've already got it wrong. But it is something that we need to be considering as we're moving forward. Let
me just add a little gloss to that, because I agree with everything that Sarah's just said. But the difficulty with the question of imposing is that we don't always do it intentionally, and we don't only do it institutionally. So I am aware that merely from the fact of who I am and the social status that comes with who I am, and the fact that I'm articulate and have had the benefit of an education, my speech may impose more than I realize it. And consequently, and I think that is absolutely the challenge of Black Lives Matters and everything that's happening around us. Those people, and I, as somebody has benefited from a variety of privileges in my life, have to be especially personally aware of the how my speech can be interpreted, can be perceived by others. So it's not only institutional, it relates much more widely.
Thank you, both of you. Just to break things up a bit and do a bit of a shift, we've got one hand up here from Anna Sharp-Jones. So Anna, before we go on to people's questions that they've put in the chat, would you like to just turn your audio and video on, or just your audio on, to ask Francois and Sarah?
Thank you. Thanks for that. Hi. So yeah, I'm actually working on a project at the moment. Well, I'm sort of trying to adapt it as of lockdown, about voice and connection, and I'm really wanting it to be an outreach and participatory project. But because it's really my first, I was wondering, Francois, if there was any advice you could give on the best ways or the best approaches or methods for actually accessing and reaching out to potential participants. Obviously we have online, but I'm talking kind of more strategy than anything else.
Are you trying to engage participants whilst you're still in lockdown?
I think I'm trying to spread the word, I suppose, about it. The idea, as it's sort of become adapted, is that given that the talk of the most likely thing that we will be allowed to do will be site specific, where we can still keep distance. So it's still under development, and I'm really realizing that by the time it's ready to go, so to speak, there will probably be more things lifted anyway. So it's not with a sort of immediate effect that I want to engage people. I'm just wondering how I can put the feelers out, really.
it's difficult partly because of when I learned and became involved in community arts. I mean, none of the tools that are available now existed then, and so my way of involving people in projects has always been to go to them and talk to them, and
Okay.
and so the sometimes that meant literally knocking on doors of a housing estate. Sometimes that meant going to local community groups. Sometimes it would mean going to a school. Sometimes and saying, we're wanting to do this project. Does it interest you? Do you want to be part of it? So and so all of that that work. So for instance, even the creative writing project, that happened because the way that was done was I went to see 5 elderly day groups and talked to them about what we were thinking of doing, and invited them to come to the Attenborough Centre where the sessions were held.
Oh.
And I think it's because, for me, that human relationship is the start of everything. It's the reason for everything. That I need to connect with people in some direct way, rather than through social media or posters or any of those other mechanisms. And the difficulty now, of course, is that that is immensely difficult, because groups aren't meeting, and when they are meeting, how we will be able to do things is really difficult. But what I would say is I would say get back on the telephone. Telephones are a much underestimated technology now, but particularly for older people. There's something magical about a telephone. It has an intimacy that no other technology has. You know, when you talk to somebody, there's kind of dialogue in your ear. So I would talk to people on the telephone and secure your social distancing rather than sending emails.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I'm fully resonating with this direct contact. That's really what the whole thing's going to be about. Great. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Anna. And Anna, it's worth looking in the chat as well, because there have been a couple of people who have responded as well in the chat.
Lovely. Thank you.
Just to give everyone a heads up that we've probably got around another 10 minutes for questions, and we've had quite a few in now. So I apologise if we don't get round to your question. Ben Anderson from In Good Company is welcoming anyone who we don't get round to their question to email them into him, and we can try and get some responses to you outside of the webinar. But the first question I've got is from Paula, who said, I wondered if you could speak a bit about the idea of democracy and consensus. Who has the power of decision?
I mean, in my work, if you can't find consensus, you can't go forward. I have never wanted to work in a project where I reserved to myself the right to decide what was going to happen. So the whole of the skill, the whole of the craft, the art of this work is that people are learning from each other all the time. They're adjusting their positions. And I am too. I am making I'm accepting things that maybe at the beginning of the project I didn't think I wanted or wouldn't accept. But because for me, what matters is that no one's left behind. Everybody believes in what's being made. Everybody can sign up to it. It is everybody feels a common ownership over it, then I've done a couple of online conversations with a friend from America called Arlene Goldbard, who's been working in this field for longer than me. And we did a couple of Zoom conversations just to talk first about the ethics of participatory art, and secondly about the future of participatory art. And they're both now, the recordings are online. But one of the things that Arlene says, talking about the ethics, and she'd written a thing which I put on my website, on the A Restless Art website, but she concludes her reflection on ethics as, in effect, by saying ethics is not something an ethical problem is not something to solve. It's not like an obstacle that you find your way through and then you get on with real life. It is real life. It is the point. And that's true about all of this. The point is to work with those disagreements. That's where the good stuff happens. Yeah. And don't think, oh, well, we just got to get past this and then we can get on with making art again. No, you're making art by negotiating those disagreements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sarah, if you've got anything to add to that, I'm just going to let everyone know that we're swapping interpreters back to Donna. Thank you, Stacey. Sarah, do you have anything to add before we go on?
I don't know. I mean, I'm really here just to talk about how we imagine this working in Derby Can, rather than to offer my own opinions, because, yeah, I stand in the shadow of Francois. So I'll just chip in as and when Derby Can things come up.
I've got a question from Caroline saying, how do you get that balance of, in brackets, what you bring in your back pocket and the openness of what the non-professionals bring and want? When you want to recruit people who aren't already engaged in a group, you need to give a sense of what they're letting themselves in for. So how do you have enough to tempt and start with?
It's another very good question. I think for me, every project is about making the creation of art. I know what the art was supposed to be, I'm thinking of making, might not end up being that, but so the invitation is typically we're making a book, or we're making a play, or we're making a mural, whatever it may be. And I've often had this image in my mind of hurdling. I'm not a sports person, and I couldn't get over a hurdle without a stepladder. But when you see people hurdling, it's amazing, because they run and then they leap and so on. And it's a really difficult thing to do. And what some bad teaching does is it concentrates on helping people acquire the skills to get over the hurdle. What I think community art has always done is concentrate on what the finishing line is. Where do we want to get to? And then people scramble over the hurdles without really thinking about them as so much. In other words, you're highlighting the purpose, the intention, the thing that you are trying to make. And in my experience, if people like that idea, people want to be in a play, that's enough. And then you start working out, well, okay, how are we going to make a play or a film or whatever it is we're making? But it's the wish to be part of something and create something that gets people over the difficulties.
Okay, great, thank you. I've had a question in from Rick saying, would you consider, and again, we're here because we're here, as conciliatory or emancipatory?
I okay, let me begin by saying, I think it's a really beautiful piece of work. There's lots of art that I admire, but wouldn't necessarily want to do myself. I think it was a moving piece of work. It was a very imaginative piece of work. I think the whole question of how we memorialize conflict is deeply troubling and difficult. How do you memorialize moments like the First World War in ways that seem to be morally, ethically, politically acceptable to you, given that we all have different opinions about those things? So I think it was a beautiful piece of work. It touched people very deeply. And to that extent, it was conciliatory. But I think there's a place for conciliatory work. Sometimes we need conciliation, and possibly over the memorialization of conflicts is an important area where we do need conciliation. So yes, I think that it did not. I don't think it offered a great deal of empowerment to the 1,600 people who participated in it, in the sense that their input into it was relatively constrained. I think it opened up some valuable personal experiences. Let me move it. Let me make a point also about what's his name, Spencer Tunick. So what's very interesting, I mean, although I'm not greatly enthusiastic about his work, I recognize that there are people who are, and I've read interviews with people who said it was a profoundly transformative experience to be part of that moment. And I know that there are people who travel the world to take their clothes off for Spencer Tunick. And I absolutely respect that. I'm not saying that in a Weasley voice. I absolutely do respect that. The fundamental, the foundation of all my work is respecting the right and autonomy of people to make their own judgments about what they want to be involved in and how they want to be involved in it. I just know what I want to be involved in and how I want to work on it. So yeah, I think it's a different kind of work. I don't think, but that doesn't make it a bad work. It just makes it occupy another part of that territory.
Okay, thank you. I think we've, if Sarah agrees, I think we've probably got time for one more question before we move on to just the further information that we're going to look at about the commissioning process. And that is from Paul saying, in forming new groups for artistic participation, what methods, techniques or vocabulary would you suggest using to persuade non-artists to get involved in projects when you as an artist are not really sure what exactly it is yet?
Okay, I've always tried to speak as directly as I can. The language is really important. So I use the terms participatory art and community art because mostly people understand them. When I started working, people didn't really understand what a community artist was, but that was okay. They didn't object. I didn't get pushback to that idea. It was kind of, well, what do you mean by that? And then you could talk. You were in a conversation. Today, my experience is that if you say you want to do a community art project, most people have an idea. It might not be your idea, but they've got an idea, and generally a fairly positive idea that it'll be an enjoyable and a nice thing and community-oriented social type thing. I mean, in all that I've written as well, I've consciously tried to use the same approach as in community art. I try to write in language that anybody could understand. I don't deceive myself that anybody can and will read my books or my blogs, but I try to make sure that if you're willing to put in the effort to do a bit of reading, there won't be words in it that you will think, I don't understand what that means. Now, of course, we've all got different levels of vocabulary and comfort with reading and words, so that is tricky. But I can only say that speaking using direct language and an approach which is open and honest, being prepared to admit that you don't know, or that you don't have the answer to this question, or that this is what you think you're doing, but it might work out differently. All of that I've found completely acceptable to people. It's only when you're seen to be not being straight with people that you get into difficulty, I think, in my experience.
Great, thank you. I apologise to people who have asked a question and we haven't got round to it. There are some really good questions that we haven't been able to bring up, so apologies. And like I said again, if you would like to pose those questions to Francois or Sarah, if you can just email Ben, then we'll see if we can get a response to you. So I'm just going to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to talk about the next step with Derby Can. And just to say a huge thank you to Francois. Really, really interesting stuff and really useful. I'm sure that the chat it's well worth looking at the chat, because the chat has been incredibly positive. So thanks again. And Sarah, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Rosie. And yeah, I'll just add my thanks to Francois. That was fantastic. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about how you can apply for the artist training programme. And I'm going to read it just so that for access purposes. So the training programme will be a series of 12 workshops working with artists Leo K, the Bulb People, Quad, China Plate and Dada. You must be able to commit to all of the sessions, the dates, and further information on this is available on the Derby Theatre website. We'll be taking 12 artists on this specific journey. You will interrogate what terms like co-creation and co-production mean for your practice, and you'll shape up a project idea. You'll then, at the end of the training programme, be able to pitch this idea, and one of those ideas will be awarded a £10,000 commission, although all artists will be given a training bursary of £225 and will obviously gain from all of this training and reflection time. If you aren't successful for this cohort, there will be more opportunities in the future to apply for other things. How to apply will be on the Derby Theatre website tomorrow morning, along with a BSL video of the call out also. But I'll give you a brief summary of it now. You will need to send in either 2 sides of A4 or a video or a voice note which answers the following questions. 1. Following the session today, tell us your thoughts on co-creation and how it might impact on your practice. 2. Can you tell us about an example of your work? It doesn't have to be about how you've used co-creation before, but it should explain who you are as an artist. 3. How will you benefit from the training programme and the opportunity to pitch? Please ensure before submitting your application that you can commit to the workshop dates, which are all in the call out, which will be on the website. The deadline for application will be 12 noon of the 3rd of July. The 3rd of July, 12 noon. And as I said, all of the details for all of this will be on the website tomorrow morning. Remember also, there's a wider information session about the Derby Can project and This is Derby on the 22nd of June, and you can book for that today. That's on the website today. So your call for action now is book onto the information session on the 22nd of June if you want to know more about the projects. From tomorrow, check out the Derby Theatre website for how to apply for the Derby Can training programme, and go and have a cup of tea and reflect on everything that you've heard today. So that's hopefully everything there. We've just got 5 minutes if anyone's got any quick questions specifically regarding that opportunity. I'll just keep my eye on the... Oh, Rosie's back, great.
Yeah.
Phew.
There's been nothing that's come up so far. What I might suggest we do is, just because we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, we might just keep the chat going.
Yeah.
And any questions that you've got about the process, just pop them in the chat. And you can pop them in so that everyone can see them, so that Sarah can see them as well. And I'll let everyone know when we're closing that down. Also, just to let you know, there will be an FAQ a sheet that's going to be sent round to everyone that I think Ben is writing out about the commissioning process as well. So that'll be coming round to you. Just while the chat's kind of going off at the moment, just to say again, thank you to Francois, thank you Sarah, thank you to everyone behind the scenes of the webinar, Ben and Susan, and to Katie, our captioner from Stage Text, and Donna and Stacey from Theatre Sign, and then thank you for everyone in attendance as well. So I'm gonna go silent now, and just to say goodbye, and I will give you a heads up when we're turning the chat off, but I hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks, Rosie. I'll just pick up on a couple of things that are in the chat. Yes, the session is recorded, and we're aiming, I think, to get it onto the Derby Theatre website from tomorrow, and it will be BSL interpreted and captioned, etc. My colleague Caroline's just asked me to remind you, so this is Derby's the overarching city approach to how we're working with young people. Reimagine is the project name, just so that people don't get confused. So that's what we'll be talking about in the information session.
Sarah, there's one more question about, is it just for Derby-based / East Midlands artists?
So it's for artists. What Derby Can is trying to create is an ecology around Derby. So what we're not looking to develop at the moment are artists who, to use Francois' words, are going to parachute in, do a project and disappear. We want to create an artist who are connected to Derby. So you don't have to live in Derby necessarily, although why don't you? It's a great city. But you need to be connected into Derby. So you need to be living within not a million miles away in order to be able to work with our communities on a regular basis. You need to have an interest in our communities and an understanding of what the specific challenges are to this place-based approach to making work are, and that might mean that you've got some connection or some previous history in working here. So that's what we're looking for. I should say as well, sorry, I'm just watching chat as well. Professor Alex Nunn from the University of Derby is evaluating the project, and there are a variety of surveys and things like that which are regularly going out to artists. So please do make sure that you're signed up with in good company at least, because then we'll make sure that you're on our radar. I think that brings us just to perfect time. Right, are you happy for us to wrap up there, Ben and Rosie?
Yeah, that's bang on one. That's great.
Perfect. It's nice to have some space for people at the end as well. That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.